Assalamualaikum, this is Snan and today we are going to talk about Pons. Since it is a lecture of neuroanatomy, we are concerned with gross appearance and the internal structures of the Pons. I have tried to summarize the whole lecture in one page, so please be sure to note the whole lecture along with learning. So let's start. Pons. The pons, its literal mean is bridge. Now on the anterior surface of the pons, why it is called bridge? Because on the anterior surface of pons, it connects the two cerebellar hemisphere. So it acts as a bridge, that is why it is called pons. So it is present anterior to the cerebellum and between the medulla and midbrain. Here is a diagram. This whole structure is medulla, which we have discussed in the earlier lecture. This structure whole is the pons, and these structure are the cerebellar hemisphere. Now you can see that the pons is acting as a bridge between this cerebellar hemisphere and this cerebellar hemisphere. So it is connecting the two cerebellar hemispheres. On the gross appearance, now on anteriorly, we see transverse fibers converging on each side, which are the fibers of middle cerebellar peduncle. As I have discussed in the earlier lecture, that is, middle cerebellar peduncle is a bundle of white matter which connects the pons to the cerebellum. This is the brainstem, and the brainstem contains three peduncles: superior, middle and inferior peduncle. The peduncle we see at the level of pons is this one, that is the middle cerebellar peduncle, which connects the pons with the cerebellum on the sides. On the anterior aspect, we also see a groove known as basilar groove, which lodges the basilar artery. This is the pons, and on the anterior aspect there is a groove here shown. This is known as the basilar groove, which lodges the basilar artery. On the anterolateral surface, the trigeminal nerve arises from the pons. This nerve has two branches, that is the medial root and the lateral root. Medial root is short, lateral root is long. Medial root is the motor in nature and the lateral root is sensory in nature. Here is pons, and we can see that at its anterolateral aspect, this is the nerve, which is the trigeminal nerve, which is arising. It has a short medial root and a long and a large sensory root. Now on the anterior aspect, there is a groove between the pons and the medulla below. It from medial to lateral side give rise to three nerves, that is abductor nerve, the fascial nerve, actually it is FACIL, fascial nerve, and the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is the medulla and this is the pons. Now the groove between it is this portion. So if we move from medial to lateral aspect, we get the root of the abductor nerve, we get the root of the fascial nerve, and we get the root of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Now talking about the posterior view of the pons. Posteriorly, it is hidden by the cerebellum. This one is the anterior view, but we can see that the cerebellum winds around backward and covers its back portion. The posterior surface forms the upper half of the fourth ventricle, which we are going to talk about in a separate lecture, and it is limited laterally by the superior cerebellar peduncle, which we have discussed earlier. Here is the posterior view of the pons. This area is pons, and since it is blocked by the cerebellum, we have removed the cerebellum from this area. Now we can see that it forms a cavity inside. It is more visible in the cut section here. This is the anterior portion, this is the posterior portion. Now in the cut section we can clearly see the cavity for the fourth ventricle. And similarly, if we see the posterior aspect, the pons is limited laterally by the superior cerebellar peduncle here, and also this side laterally by the superior cerebellar peduncle. So posteriorly, the pons is divided into two halves by a median sulcus. This is the posterior view of the pons, and you can see that it contains a median sulcus which divides it into right and left portion. Now there are elevations lateral to this sulcus which are known as the medial eminence, this one and this one, and you can see that this median eminence is expanded inferiorly, and this inferior expanded portion is known as fasciculus. Now this medial eminence is bounded laterally by another sulcus known as sulcus limitant. Further lateral to this sulcus is an area here, this area, it is known as the vestibular area. So this one is the median eminence and this one is the vestibular area. Vestibular area contains the underlying vestibular nucleus, which we are going to talk about in the cut section. The sulcus limitant has a bluish gray part, superior part, which is due to deeply pigmented nerve cells, and this area is known as the substantia ferruginea. A quick region, the posterior portion is divided into two halves by the median sulcus. Elevation lateral to the median sulcus are known as median eminence, and the inferior expanded portion of medial eminence is known as fasciculus. Now, the medial eminence is bounded laterally by the sulcus limitant, whose bluish gray superior part, which is due to deeply pigmented nerve cell, is known as substantia ferruginea, while the area lateral to the sulcus limitant is known as the vestibular area, which contains the underlying vestibular nuclei. Now talking about the internal structure of the pons, there is a transverse fibers of trapezoid bodies which divide its cut section into a posterior tegmentum and an anterior basal part. Here is the cut section of pons, and this area here, which contains fibers arising from both sides, this little point is known as the trapezoid body. Now this is the anterior side of the pons, and this one is the posterior side of the pons. So the area behind the trapezoid body is known as tegmentum, while the area in front of the pons is known as, in front of the trapezoid body is known as the basal part. The tegmentum, the basal part. If we make transverse section for studying, we make them at two levels. That is through the caudal part of the pons and through the cranial part of the pons. So from the caudal part, we make this section through the fasciculus, which we have discussed is the expanded inferior portion of the medial eminence, while through the cranial part we make a section through the trigeminal nuclei, which is the nucleus of the fifth cranial nerve. First of all, talking about the section through the caudal part, that is the fasciculus, we see a number of structures. First of all, we see the trapezoid body in the transverse section, which I have discussed earlier. It is formed via the fibers from the cochlear nuclei and that of its own trapezoid body. So in the caudal part section, we also observe different nuclei. We observe lemniscus and fasciculus. If we recall from the lecture of tracts, I have explained earlier that the lemniscus is a bundle of nerve fibers in the form of a ribbon. So The medial lemniscus is the bundle of nerve fibers from the medial lemniscus dorsal column, medial lemniscus tract. So the medial lemniscus here rotates. Let me explain how. Here is a flat paper. So let us assume that it contains a number of nerve fibers which arrange themselves in the form of a flat ribbon. So a number of the fibers of dorsal column medial lemniscus tract are arranged in the form of a flat paper. So at the level of the pons at its caudal part, these form medial lemniscus. So that is the flat ribbon of axons. This medial lemniscus rotates into a transverse position. Here is the medial lemniscus shown in such a way that its rotation causes it to gain its long axis in the horizontal position. So the medial lemniscus rotates here in such a way that its long axis is in the transverse axis or horizontal axis. Furthermore, it is also accompanied by the lateral and the spinal lemniscus, which are in the lecture of the tracts. Talking about the fasciculus, when the axons combine in such a way that they form a solid rod, that structure is known as fasciculus. In medial lemniscus they form a ribbon, while in fasciculus they form a solid rod. So here we observe a rod that is medial longitudinal fasciculus. Now what is this medial longitudinal fasciculus? It is the main pathway which connects the vestibular and cochlear nucleus we observe at this level to the nuclei which control the extraocular muscles. Which nuclei? Abducens nuclei, which we have discussed earlier. Furthermore, oculomotor and the trochlear nuclei. Here the structure shown in pink, which is present beneath the floor of this fourth ventricle. Here this area which is present on both sides of the midline is known as the medial longitudinal fasciculus. It connects the vestibular and the cochlear nucleus with the abducens nuclei, oculomotor and the trochlear nuclei, which are not shown here. So medial longitudinal fasciculus is beneath the floor of the fourth ventricle. Now talking about different nuclei. Now first nuclei we see are three nuclei which are present in the midline. Moving from medial to lateral, we have already discussed the nucleus of the abducens nerve, nucleus of the facial nerve and the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Now fun thing here is that the nucleus of the facial nerve, the fibers from this wind around the nucleus of the abducens nerve to form the inferior elevation which we call facial colliculus. Here is the abducens nuclei, here is the facial nuclei, and here is the trigeminal nuclei along with its spinal tract. Now the fibers from the facial nuclei, they arise and wind round the nuclei of the abducens nerve, so they form an elevation known as the facial colliculus, which we have seen here as the elevation on the inferior aspect of the median eminence. Other nuclei we see are the medial vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei, which we have also seen in medulla in the previous lecture. Here is the vestibular nuclei, which is close to the floor of the cavity for fourth ventricle, and this structure is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is specific to the medulla. So it's since it is the caudal portion, so this inferior cerebellar peduncle is visible. So medial to it is the vestibular nuclei, while anterior and posterior to it are the anterior and posterior cochlear nuclei respectively. vestibular nuclei, anterior cochlear nuclei, and posterior cochlear nuclei. If we talk specifically, this vestibular nuclei is the medial vestibular nuclei. Finally, we see pontine nuclei. Now, pontine nuclei, it receives the corticopontine fiber from above, that is the cerebral cortex, and gives the transverse fiber to the middle cerebellar peduncle, which I have explained, that a bundle of the white fibers which connect the pons with the cerebellum. So it links, since these fibers are coming from the cortex and these are going to the cerebellum, so we can say that the pontine nuclei link the cerebellar cortex to the cerebellum. Here at the basal part we can see small black dots which are the pontine nuclei. They take fibers from the above from the cerebral cortex and give transverse fibers to the middle cerebellar peduncle, which enters the cerebellum, which was present on its sides like this. We can also see that the fibers from the pontine nuclei, they pass through the bundles of the corticospinal and corticonuclear tract, dividing them into smaller portions. Now, talking about the section through the cranial part, this one is almost the same as that of the caudal part, but instead of the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, we see the main nucleus, that is the motor nuclei, and the sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, and this sensory nuclei is continuous with the spinal nuclei which were present in beneath it. Here is the cut section at the cranial level of the pon. So you can see that the shape of the fourth ventricle is also changed, and there are instead of the spinal nuclei there and the tract of the trigeminal nerve, it contains the main nuclei, that is the motor nuclei of the trigeminal nerve and the main sensory nuclei. And this main sensory nuclei, the fiber from it goes downward and are continuous with the nuclei of the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve, which were present at the section through the caudal portion. Also, the superior cerebellar peduncle, which we have also seen in the caudal part section, here it is also present, but its position, instead of lateral, it becomes the posterolateral to the fourth ventricle cavity. Also, it is joined by the spinocerebellar tract, which we have discussed in the lecture of tracts. Here we can see that this green portion is the superior cerebellar peduncle, which instead of here, that is lateral to the cavity of the fourth ventricle, it has become posterolateral to the cavity of the fourth ventricle. Lastly, the lateral and the spinal lemniscus, which were accompanying the medial lemniscus, instead of accompanying it, they lie at the lateral extremity of the medial lemniscus. Here is the medial lemniscus, and at its lateral extremity we get the spinal lemniscus. So that was all for today's lecture. Please subscribe the channel and thank you.